And we're recording, and our phone is on silent. It's good to be here. What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Today, we are going to get on a little Marie high horse, and we're going to redefine self-care in general and for therapists. And yes, I have a high horse to get on with self-care, not just because it's a good idea to care for ourselves, not just because we are ethically obligated by our code of conduct, at least as psychologists, to prioritize self-care, but because I think we're doing self-care all wrong when we're even trying to do it, So today's episode is not scripted, not even a little bit. I'm just going to share my thoughts and my feelings about self-care. Maybe we can start to rewrite a little bit how we perceive self-care, how we pursue it individually as well as promote it as a profession. And I hope that you just generally find some encouragement in this episode. So let's talk a little bit about self-care. What is it? Why do we have to take care of ourselves? I don't know. Do I need to define that? Yeah, let's talk about it. Okay, Merriam-Webster, help us out. Care for oneself, specifically healthcare provided by oneself, often without the consultation of a medical professional. That's not the definition I'm using. Okay, I guess we're having trouble defining self-care then. I thought that was going to be an easy win, and providing your own healthcare without the consultation of a medical professional, which I guess, I don't know. What's Marie's definition of self-care? One of those things where you're like, how do you define that word that everyone knows? And then when you actually get to thinking about it, you don't know how to define it. If I were to define self-care, it's less about a specific action and more of a mindset, an approach, a prioritization of saying like, I am worthy of taking care of myself. And so I'm going to prioritize taking care of myself on my list of life priorities. And then our behaviors will align with our priorities, but the shape and packaging that those behaviors take can look quite different from person to person, and they can look quite different for the same person from moment to moment. And that is the first thing I really wanted to talk about in this episode, because it's so buzzy to talk about self-care, which on the one hand is great. We should totally be talking about it. I'm doing that right now. And as I see it represented, it's kind of packaged in these neat packages. I mean, I think we've all seen the sort of tropes of self-care as represented as like, painting your nails and like getting a massage and having a bubble bath. And don't get me wrong, those things very well can be part of someone's self-care practices, but those things by themselves are not enough to encompass all self-care. So I'm wanting to really poke at this idea that self-care is like a to-do item that we insert in our list of daily activities or weekly activities. I rather want to see self-care as like a thing that's tailor-made to support your overall well-being, that's open to shifting and changing depending on your shifting and changing needs from one moment to the next, and keeping your care as a priority. Like, you could break it down behaviorally, but it's going to be kind of so granular that it becomes ineffective to do it as a list of behaviors, because we could say that like me eating lunch is an act of self-care. It is an act of my own self-care. If I don't eat lunch, I'm not prioritizing myself and my own needs, and so I'm neglecting my own self-care by skipping lunch. Anything we do to like sustain our life, support our well-being, is an act of self-care. So I would like for us to move away from the framework of like, did you check the boxes of like behaviors that we somehow decided count as self-care behaviors, and move more towards like, where are you in your list of priorities? If we took an inventory of all of your actions and behaviors over the last 7 days, how many of those actions and behaviors were geared towards supporting your own well-being, supporting your own ability to keep living, your own emotional health, your own physical health, all of the plethora of needs and desires that someone has? Like, what percentage of your activities and choices in the last week were directed towards you? And what percentage were directed towards somewhere else? Now, I definitely don't claim to know like what percentage in the last week is the appropriate amount for someone to dedicate towards self-care, I think that could just become problematic again in the same way, where it's like I need to spend X percentage of my day or my week focused on myself. And I think it's more helpful to just take an inventory. Like, where am I prioritizing myself? Like, is it, if we look at my actions in the last week, is it like I prioritized my therapy clients and then my kids and then my partner and then my friends and then that, Joe Schmo down the street that needed some help and then me? Or is it like in the milieu of things that are most important to me, I see how I was giving myself just as much support and attention as I was my clients and my kids and my spouse. And of course, there's going to be some weeks where it's like, well, yeah, my partner went through that medical emergency. And so I gave all of myself towards, getting them the care that they needed and all of that. And so my self-care got deprioritized, necessarily so because I made a choice that aligned with my values. Or, like when babies came out of my body, suddenly the amount of time that I spent taking care of myself drastically dropped. And I would argue, as it should be, because like someone has to take care of these humans. So I took care of these humans and it meant that I was getting up every hour and a half at night, which is like terrible self-care, quote unquote. But it's what was necessary to lean into my values of keeping these humans alive that I also opted to bring into this world. And they're my responsibility. And it's my joy, even if I'm tired. I can't figure out how I want to phrase what I'm trying to say, but there's just something about how we're approaching self-care that just seems vastly incorrect to me. And also that like the way we frame it seems so self-centered. It's like there's me time, and that is separate from time for somebody else or time that's towards some work task or something. For me, I think of self-care, part of my self-care is working. It supports my well-being to have this thing that I get up and do every day. Thinking about the next video that I'm going to film supports my overall well-being. It's like sitting down and filming a video for my job, which is what this is. Most people wouldn't count that as a self-care activity, but it is part of my overall support for my self-care. It also helps pay my bills, which supports my well-being. So I guess it's slippery to try to contain like what things count as self-care or not when I'm trying to redefine it as more of like a mindset, an approach. How do you prioritize yourself overall amongst all of the things that you value? And so I think maybe that's why we end up kind of repackaging it and kind of dumbing it down, honestly, into these little cutesy behaviors and choices. Don't get me wrong. I love painting my nails. I do my own facial things. Like I kind of do the stuff that people say count as self-care, but I don't consider that to be like a check the box. I like went out for a walk today, self-care complete. Now I'm going to give myself fully to something else. And I can feel myself kind of leading into another point that I want to bring up about how I'm seeing us approach self-care just generally, culturally. I'm not saying that you individually listening to this episode are doing this per se, but I think as a culture we are doing this, where self-care ends up being packaged in these little time-limited moments throughout our life. We need to spend an hour a day being selfish. It's time for me and no one else. And then otherwise, it kind of opens the door to seeing it as like the rest of our time then is fully for other people. That's when we're maybe neglecting ourselves or giving away from ourselves. And though life is a continuous balance of like filling ourselves and emptying our tank, like that is living, I think, almost by definition, like breathing air in and exhaling it out, doing it over and over and over again. I think it can get a little dangerous if we start to see self-care as sort of actions that counterbalance the other things in our lives that cost us something. Again, we're in like the gray nuance things where I think my thought process could sound slippery. It's not black and white. I was giving parts of myself when I was waking up at 3 a.m. feeding my child. That's not giving something to me in that moment per se, but it does give me something to keep this child alive, know that I'm capable of doing that, and like care for her needs over the years. That does give me something. So this specific moment, I'm losing something, but in the long term, I am gaining something. So it's just more complicated than I think we make it out to be. And what can happen then, I think if we see it as more like mathematical and calculated, like I do some self-care for me, and then I give some of myself to you, is we can start to see our lives as these transactions. There's things that fill me up and there's things that empty me out. And we just hope that we can balance all the emptying that we're doing with enough stuff that fills us up. I think if as a society and culturally we see our own self-care this way, in this transactional manner, then there are a lot of cracks in the system where there's opportunities for people to take advantage of us. For example, I think of like the number of times that I'll hear like the absolute most well-meaning friend ever, but like someone who's embedded in the same culture who might respond to hearing a friend say that like work is super stressful by saying like, oh, well, what have you done to take care of yourself? And at face value, that may seem like a very reasonable question to ask. And it may actually be a helpful question to ask on the list of questions to ask. My line of questioning would start somewhere else. Like I'd be like, oh, tell me about your stress at work. Where's that coming from? Well, let's figure out which part of that isn't working. Is it that, your workplace is inherently stressful by definition, but you just kind of maybe lost connection with your reasons for choosing into that path? Is it that there's some inappropriate reason why your workplace is stressful, like somebody is treating you poorly or expecting too much of you or something like that, in which case it may require some problem solving? Or is it possible that there's something about the nature of the stresses of your workplace that aren't really compatible or aligned with you, your values, your personality, etc.? I would want to start with those questions before I jump to like, did you schedule a massage this weekend? It starts to feel like somebody is saying like, ow, my toe hurts, and then responding by saying like, would you like to go get a pedicure? And it's like, those are two separate items. I get how like a pedicure will do something for my toe, but it may be completely unrelated to the problem that I'm trying to address. But sure, by all means, if you want to get the pedicure, go for it. But like, that's not necessarily the solution to the problem. You know what I mean? So if let's say you're a therapist, which I know a lot of you are, and you're feeling stressed at work, which I know a lot of you are, rather than responding to that by immediately jumping to like a quote unquote typical self-care activity, like, did you book that massage for next weekend? To instead ask a little bit more about the nature of the stress. Is it that you're stressed because the nature of our work, by definition, is inherently quite stressful? Which it is. If that's the case, then I'd want to kind of check in to see like, are the stresses exceeding what you anticipated would be the case when you signed up for this job? Or is it that you've kind of gotten out of touch with whatever values have encouraged you to choose a line of work that's quite stressful? Like it kind of would be like if a firefighter said that their job is really stressful because they're always having to walk into burning buildings. And it's like, yes, that definitely sounds very stressful to me. And it's also like, did you know that it was going to be like that when you signed up for this career? And I think for a lot of folks, they might say they did realize it was going to be like that. And they signed up for it because there's some greater purpose. There's some greater value. It's worth it to me because it means the world to me to know that I rescued that person out of that burning building, or I was able to save their home from burning down, or fill in the blanks. It's going to be a different answer for different people, but it's going to sound like, there's this thing that's bigger than just my stress. That's a reason why I signed up for this thing. And I imagine for a lot of therapists, that's also going to be true. Like, I knew this job was going to be stressful, but I have these greater reasons, these bigger purpose for why I signed up for this inherently stressful job. And so if that's the case, then I'd check in, like, is there something that made you kind of get a little bit disconnected from the part of you that wants to be in this job, even though it's stressful? Can we find a way to reconnect with those values? That might be an act of self-care. And then from there, you might say, okay, is this stress like above and beyond though what's reasonable to ask of yourself? It might get nuanced from there. Like, yeah, I knew this job would be stressful, but maybe the amount of stress is now exceeding what I anticipated, or I'm learning about myself that I can only do this much before I start to decline in my ability to kind of stay healthy. And then you might say, okay, do we need to see if it's an option to make some sort of adjustment so that the amount of stress matches better what you anticipated signing up for. That is an act of self-care. That is a great act of self-care. It wouldn't be an act of self-care to just say, oh, my work is stressful. It is what it is. Let me just schedule an extra massage this week or an extra yoga class or whatever. For some people, that might be actually what you need. But I think in a lot of cases, it kind of misses the problem. And it's much more helpful to really reflect on ourselves, who we are, our capacities, personalities, capabilities, our trigger points, like everything, and then measure it up to whatever kind of feels like it's throwing us off balance to see if we can get to the root of the problem a little bit more. What we end up seeing for a lot of therapists, I think in particular, is because we know we signed up for a stressful job. And when our work gets stressful, we tie it to that affiliation. Well, I knew that being a therapist would be really stressful. Of course, I need to counterbalance that stress somewhere else by kind of taking care of myself elsewhere. What can happen though is a lot of times the source of the stress is something unreasonable, like your boss is mistreating you or your workplace is expecting you to see way too many clients compared to what's reasonable. And what I see happen in a lot of cases is that a lot of folks will sort of write off the workplace stress as like, it's just part of the job. It comes with the job. It's what I signed up for. I got my greater purpose. So let me try to cope. Let me push through, when there may actually be a real problem happening that's going completely unnoticed or unaddressed. And so in this case, self-care might be asking like, okay, if I'm noticing that my boss keeps treating me in a way that's demeaning or overworking me or just belittling, whatever it might be, then it's much more helpful to say like, okay, so your boss is mistreating you. What are our options? What does it look like to move forward rather than just like suck it up? And even then, if that's the case, there is no one size fits all solution. Even though I didn't script this video, I did do some snooping around on the internet to see what's out there on this topic. And I liked this APA article by Barnett and Hominy called The New Self-Care. It's not all about you. Their main point in the article is actually that when we're left to our own devices, we are actually pretty terrible at self-care. They say, quote, the American Psychological Association Ethics Code mandates ongoing self-monitoring and self-assessment to determine when one's competence is at risk or already degraded, and the need to then take needed corrective actions. This is the part I wanted to focus on though. Yet research findings demonstrate how flawed self-assessment is and that many clinicians will not know when assistance is needed or what support or interventions are needed. Instead, a communitarian approach to self-care is recommended. This involves creating and actively utilizing a competence constellation of engaged colleagues who assess and support each other on an ongoing basis. The too long didn't read of what I just read is essentially research shows that therapists are really bad at assessing when they need help and what that help even would look like once they catch on to the fact that they might need some help. Rather, it's much more effective to have other people in our lives help with that assessment, offer recommendations, because they're going to be much more effective at catching when we need something and knowing what interventions we need to steer us in a healthier direction. Imagine that. I think it does require promoting kind of cultural values of safety in our spaces where therapists are interacting with each other, prioritizing those spaces in general, and having a space where we invite the feedback of others even when we haven't specifically asked for it. It's usually like somebody's thinking they're stuck with something else, and then as they're talking in consult group or something like that, you're like, wait a minute. I know you were saying you were stuck on this thing with your client, but actually as I heard that story, I was kind of worried about you. Like, are you doing okay? Having a space where it's free enough and safe enough to have that kind of pivot in conversation is so invaluable. And if somehow this comes across as complainy, I know I can skew that way, but really, like, even if I'm complaining, my goal is to advocate for a different way. Like, something's not working, let's do it differently. Can we try something different? And that is the angle and the motivator that I'm coming from even when I'm complaining. And before we close, I'd like to thank TherapyNotes.com for sponsoring this episode. TherapyNotes helps with all of your practice management needs. They have scheduling, notes, and billing. There's a HIPAA-secure telehealth platform included for free for all users, and so much more. If you'd like to check out Therapy Notes, you can get 2 months to try it for free with no commitment just by clicking the link in the description of this video. Well, friends, Thank you for hanging with me. I always feel a bit self-conscious when I don't script a video. That is definitely a crutch that I lean on. So I sure hope it was helpful, a helpful contribution into the ether, whoever is listening out there. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well. One therapist to another. Marie. The amount of, listen, bonus info, I guess. I don't know if I'll keep this, but the amount of just Marie singing between takes of other stuff that I just cut out of my videos is extensive. I don't know. It gets my nerves out. It's not even real singing. It's just yeah, Okay, have a good day.